Yossi Yovel. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Jackson. It's my honor.
It's a pleasure having you. You have been studying bats for your whole life, or most of your life would be correct. Would that be
Yeah,
accurate?
I would say more than 20 years without revealing my exact age. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Is it true that bats don't bump into each other when they're flying? Because that's something we've been told for a long time.
Yeah, there are a lot of myths. This is one of them. Another one is people often ask me if bats always turn left when they exit their cave. I don't know where this comes from. And of course, there's the get entangled in hair, right? Myth.
Yeah, yeah.
Bats are extremely talented in not bumping into each other. But occasionally, like if you look at the exit of a cave with thousands of bats exiting and you video it, you do see that occasionally they would bump into each other. Most of these bumps are just very gentle, and they just they move a little bit and then continue their flight without any harm. So the truth is, they are very remarkable in their ability to fly in high densities without bumping to each other. But occasionally they would, and it's not a big disaster. Actually, one of the things that we do in my lab is computer modeling of this is called agent-based model. So you can model
Hmm.
thousands of bats moving together, and using such models, some of my students have shown that you can actually do pretty well when using sound. Probably we will talk about bats' use of sound. I'm jumping ahead, but you can do
Yeah.
pretty well with using sound and avoiding bumping into each other.
So they're using echolocation to avoid each other.
So that's a major question, and in our model. So first of all, maybe we should say echolocation, right? You emit sound, and then you basically the brain looks into the echoes, analyzes the echoes, and this allows you to orient. It's very similar to radar or to submarine sonar. Uh, yeah, so that's a good question. Whether they also use vision, because all bats can see, that's another myth when they're exiting these caves. But in our models, we assume that there is no vision. We assume that they can only use sound, and still we find that it's possible to fly in very high densities and avoid collisions, even if you're only using sound.
Hmm. Interesting. How good is their vision?
It's very okay. So here we should say that there are almost 1,500 species of bats, and each bat is a different story. It's like comparing,
Yeah.
I don't know, chimps to baboons. These are different animals. Both of them are
Yeah.
are primates, right? So it's the same with bats. They're very, very different from each other, and it really will depend on how they behave. So if you're a fruit bat that is looking for big fruit at night, even some of them during daytime, but let's say even at night, then your vision might be very, very strong, and also maybe your olfactory system will be very, very,
Hmm.
very good. Some of these fruit bats don't even use sonar at all. By the way, they lost their ability to use echolocation or sonar. On the other
Hmm.
hand, if you're a bat that strongly relies on echolocation to, for example, detect very small insects, mosquitoes at night, then maybe you will lose most of your vision, and your vision will be very, very rudimentary. You will mostly see very maybe large objects or something like that. So it really depends on the species. We don't know enough about bat vision. This is something that we really have to study more. But all bats can see as much as we know.
And you mentioned that some bats have lost the ability to uh, produce sonar.
Yeah, so we call them fruit bats. At least that's the common name. There are about 200 species, mostly. So this is what we call old world fruit bats. Okay, so this means like Asia, Africa, not in
Hmm.
Americas, and these bats probably we don't know if they had sonar and lost it, or maybe never had it. But probably the main I think hypothesis today is that their ancestor lost the ability to use sonar. Some of them, by the way, interestingly, one of the bats we study regained this ability. So these are bats that probably
Hmm.
moved to live in caves, and in caves it's very, very dark, as you know. And maybe this is the reason why some of them actually started using sonar again. But interestingly, they developed so evolved a new form of sonar. Instead of using their vocal cords like we are doing right now, they use their tongue, and they emit clicks with their tongue. So it sounds like their sonar link sounds like something like this, but in
Yeah,
ultrasonic
yeah.
frequencies. So it's a different form of sonar. That's also very interesting.
So they had the hardware to be able to produce and understand sonar, but then they just stopped using it for a while, or did they? Was there like a
That's a terrific
reintroduce?
question. So we know that the ancestors of all bats probably evolved somewhere around 60 million years ago, maybe a little bit before. We don't know exactly when sonar appears. There's a big debate about it. You know, people look at the fossils and they don't know if this fossil could echolocate or not. It's we don't know what exactly to examine. Maybe the ear, maybe something else. It's very interesting. We do know that, of course, modern bats, extant bats have very sophisticated brains for processing echolocation. And it
Hmm.
would be super interesting to look. This is, by the way, I once was planning to do this. We never did this. To look into the brain of non-echolocating food bats and see whether they have, as you said, the hardware for processing these echoes. The answer
Yeah.
is, I think, without going into too many hypotheses, is we just don't know.
Hmm. Is that something that's high on your radar to like we should find this out, or is that kind of like
High on my sonar.
there
uh,
you go.
yeah, it's a very hard study. So, for example, you would have to take a bat into an MRI machine, for example. Many of these bats,
Yeah.
you need to go to Asian countries where I at least don't have access to an MRI machine. So it's not an easy experiment. Maybe I can say that we have done, together with my colleague Arian Bunman, we have looked into non-echolocating fruit bats. So there was this old paper by Edwin Gould who suggested that some of these old world fruit bats will actually produce sound when flying in the dark. So we went to Thailand and we found some of these bats and we recorded them in complete darkness and we found that indeed they produce sounds that are probably somehow produced by the wings. Okay, these are wing clicking
Hmm.
bats. We don't know exactly. It's not as if we don't think the wings are hitting each other, as some people have suggested. Maybe it's the membrane that is flapping and creating. When it moves rapidly, it creates these clicks. And it might be a very simple form of echolocation. In fact, we showed in an experiment that they can probably use these very simple sounds. So this suggests it's why am I telling you all of this? It suggests how simple, producing sounds for echolocation. I could do this, and now if my brain processes the echoes, and we know that the human brain can to some extent listen to echoes and process them, then I could already know if there's something in front of me, for example. So, each of you could now go into a dark room and do this in front of a wall, and you will notice that you can hear something. By the way, I should say that all of this, the story of how we go to Thailand and how we, build this room and catch the bats to work with them, and all of this is actually described in one of the chapters in my new book, The Genius Bat. Um, yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Do you want to give a sneak preview, or you want to just leave it for those who want to buy the book?
Maybe I'll just say that this book is as much as it is about bats, it's about humans. So each of the chapters also includes an interview or is based on an interview with a scientist who's done the experiment. So in this case, I mentioned Edwin Gould, who is today in his 90s, and he ran these experiments like something like 50 years ago. And it's fascinating, and of course I talk about the bats and why they do this and what and how good are they. But it's also super interesting, in my opinion, to hear how the researchers behind the scenes, what were their ideas, why did they plan the experiment, how did when you do a new experiment that nobody has done before, you have to develop everything from the idea to the setup, to how do you get the bats into a lab, or maybe you do it in the cave. So all of this I find fascinating. I think you can really, whether you're a scientist or not, I think you can learn a lot about how science is done just by reading these stories.
Yeah. So the hardware for bats, what? Because I know dolphins have like a melon in the front of their skull that they use to echolocate. Is there something similar for bats? How does it work as
Yeah.
far as the?
Yeah, so actually, yeah, unlike dolphins, it's very similar to any mammalian, any other non-dolphin or non-tooth whaled mammalian apparatus. So basically, they use their vocal cords just like we do. There are some adaptations. They're finer. There may be more the tension is higher, so you can produce ultrasound. There's some very fast muscles that allow you to produce signals at a very high rate. but it just looks like a mammalian vocal apparatus. And in terms of the
Hmm.
reception, it's also very similar. So the ears, the inner ear, what we call the cochlea, there's some adaptations inside the cochlea. There's a membrane. In bats, it is again, once again, the tension is higher. It is finer. It allows reception of ultrasonic sounds, but it's very similar to many other mammals. And the big difference, I would say, of course, there are big ears. Some bats will have very big ears. Some bats have facial structures which are related to directing sound. So these are special
Hmm.
adaptations. But I would say that 90% of the adaptation is in the brain. So the brain has neural mechanisms that allows it to process echoes. One of them, one of the mechanisms that we understand best, by the way, the discovery of how this mechanism was discovered is also mentioned, also described in one of the chapters in the book. And this mechanism allows bats to measure range based on time, basically. So the
Hmm.
bat's brain has special neurons that allow it to assess the distance of objects based on the time that passes between emission and reception, emitting a signal and receiving an echo. And this is probably the main, I would say, magic happening in the bat's brain, but we still don't understand much about what's going on further down. How do you downstream, right? How do you translate these? So let's say you get a lot of echoes and they're all coming in at different times or distances. How do you translate this into a scene, a 3D scene, or I don't know if it's a 3D scene, but some kind of scene of the environment? So these are all
Yeah.
fascinating open questions.
And those, the ability to kind of translate it into a 3D scene, humans have that ability too, to somewhat?
Actually, we don't even know if bats have it. So yeah, humans can do
Oh.
some sort of ranging. For example, if I play a sound to you, even without the echo, you can say something about the distance sometimes. The amplitude, the spectrum tells you something about distance. Of course, direction. We're very good in telling the direction of where a sound is coming from, especially azimuth, so 2D direction. But in fact, we don't even know for sure that bats can do the full 3D. It's not a simple task from an engineering point of view, because you get two streams of audio, one to each ear. And how do you translate this into a 3D scene? An ambiguous scene is not completely clear. It's also not so easy to test. So in one experiment that we've run, we actually tested if bats can translate acoustic information into vision. So we trained bats to classify two objects that have different textures without seeing them in complete darkness, so only based on echolocation. And then we tested after the bats were able to do it using sound. We tested them in vision, so we allowed them to use vision for the first time and try to eliminate the use of echolocation by generating very loud noise. And indeed, the bats were able to translate, so they managed to identify the objects using vision. So to some extent, this shows that with vision we do have a 3D kind of percept. Probably
Hmm.
the bats have one too. This suggests that sometimes, it doesn't say that they can always create a 3D image, but in this case, it suggests that they can have some kind of a 3D perception of an object based on the echolocation information. But still, we don't know if they can do this always, and what's the accuracy of this 3D reconstruction.
Do we know if they can see color? Because I would imagine
Yeah.
for fruit bats being able to
So first
see
of all, you
color, yeah,
remember,
yeah.
yeah, it's true. With birds, this is super important, right? But you have to remember that most of them operate at night, and thus you don't have much color, right? Because
That's
and
true.
it's much more important also to invest in your night vision. So some bats are, we humans are trichromatic, right? We have RGB, right? Red, blue, green
Hmm.
photoreceptors. Most bats have only two. Most fruit bats only two. Some bats, by the way, can see in ultraviolet. So they have a third
Hmm.
ultraviolet receptor. Still, it's species specific. We still don't know for sure. And I'm not aware of experiments that tested this behaviorally. So all of what I'm saying now is based on looking at the genes for the photoreceptors. So this is another really interesting open question. I think that fruit bats can see. So we're now running some tests, and I think that they can see vision to some extent, but not as good as we can for sure.
Right. The you mentioned just a second ago the what was it? vision and their ability to see ultraviolet. How do we know that they can see ultraviolet?
Yeah, behavioral experiments have shown that. We know that at night you have more ultraviolet. We know that many insects can see ultraviolet in order to detect flowers, for example. So there are ultraviolet cues out there. This could be probably very
Hmm.
relevant also for like nectar feeding bats, and that's where it has been shown. I don't think we know enough about how they use ultraviolet vision, their ultraviolet vision yet.
How does the testing work to like what are you testing so that you understand that they can see ultraviolet vision? What does
Yeah,
that look like?
maybe I'll answer more generally. I want to know what the bat's sensory, acoustic, echolocation, visual, olfactory limits are, and how do I test it? So basically, we train bats. I mentioned this previously very quickly, and maybe I should have explained. So, for example, I said we trained bats to identify objects based on their echoes. And you could do the same with ultraviolet, for example, right? So this
Hmm.
means that usually the way this is done is that we will have two objects in a room, for example. That would be one way to do it. And then they differ in some sensory aspects. So, for example, in that case, they differed in texture. One object had holes, the other did not. So, this is something that we think should create a difference in sonar signature. And you could do the same. You could have one object reflecting ultraviolet and when one will not. And the bats have to learn. You reward them for landing or approaching only one of these objects. And of course, you switch their locations or, so they don't get fixed to a certain location. And this sometimes takes very long. If this is a hard task, it can take about months to learn because, it's not like a human where you can say, this is your task. The bat has to understand what do you want, right? And it might be, for example, two objects might be very different along some axis that I don't even imagine, and I want the bat to learn this specific cue and not something else.
Right.
So this sometimes takes months. Sometimes they don't succeed, and we don't even know. Maybe it's our fault. Maybe we just couldn't explain the task. But this is basically how you do it, and eventually you would see that over time the bat learns to land. It starts by landing on both objects equally, and over time you see that it statistically significantly prefers one of the objects, and then you run some statistical test, and then you can claim that it can do the task.
Do the how intelligent are they? Do they understand tasks easily, or does this take a lot of like you kind of have to put up a whole lot of guardrails?
So intelligence is a tough word, right? Because how do you compare intelligence and how much of it is, as I said, how much of their failure is because of my failure to explain the task. It is interesting. I will say that there's something very interesting that I can say, and that is that there are huge differences between species and huge differences between individuals, and maybe that's I think more
Hmm.
interesting. Um,
Hmm.
so some species are really learners. They're really flexible in their behavior, and they will learn. And some are not. Again, maybe I'm not building the task in a way that is suitable for these species, but it seems like something that has to do with their general flexibility. And by the way, this is also correlated with we often distinguish generalists from specialists. So some species are very generalist. They will forage everywhere. They will eat everything. They will roost everywhere. And some are very, very specialist. They have very strong preferences. And this is often also correlates with their learning capacities, I would say. And you also see differences between individuals, which is really interesting. So often there are
Hmm.
individuals that will learn very quickly, and others that will not. For example, young individuals are often very curious. They will test the setup, but sometimes they
Hmm.
will learn fast and then they will be very fixed and they will not learn something new. So there are a lot of nuances that are very interesting. Very similar to, with if I would do this with humans, I would see very similar differences.
Right. Yeah. Is the do we know if the differences in intelligence across species, just a general broad flexibility, can be tracked back to potentially the habitat they're originally from and the need to be flexible in that location?
Yeah, it's a good hypothesis. I'm not aware of a study who that tested, across. You need to test this across many, many species. So I'm not aware of somebody or something who tests this, especially on bats. But yeah, I think it's a good hypothesis that it's all related to. So how it's related to the question: how do you become a specialist or a journalist? I would say that I will say that in our modern world that is highly affected by anthropogenic effects, generalists tend to do better because they can
Mm-hmm.
adapt quickly when we change something. Some of them move into cities, for example, and live and roost and take advantage. But the specialists are really suffering because we are depriving them from their habitats and sometimes food sources or roost locations. Yeah, so that's just an interesting point.
Yeah, is there a specific species of bat that you and your team are kind of focused on?
Yeah, we work on many bats. I always say one of the reasons that I'm interested in bats is their diversity and the fact that any question you're interested in, there's a bat species that will be relevant. And part of the fun is to go. We often collaborate with colleagues around the globe who are working on their species, and we often come and collaborate with them. One of the things we do is we build these very small miniature GPS devices that can be placed on bats, and often we go and study bats in other countries. We Most of the work, or at least I would say 50% of our work, is with the Egyptian fruit bat. The
Hmm.
reason is that first of all, it's a very common bat. So you always want to work with a common bat, less, you don't want to endanger any bat that is already in risk. You want a bat that is very easy to work with. So, some bats in captivity, they do very, very bad, and you don't want to work with these bats. So the Egyptian
Hmm.
fruit bat is flexible. It's also a good learner. It's a big bat. Um, it's highly social. It uses vocal communication. So there are a lot of advantages with
Yeah.
working with it. And a lot of our work is done with it. But as I said, we also work with many other species.
How do you put a GPS tracker on a bat?
Yeah, so if we're doing this in some cave somewhere and it's a short-term project, the method is to catch the bats and then to glue the GPS in between their shoulders with what we call surgical medical glue. So it's the same. It's a
Hmm.
harmless, sorry, glue. It's like the same glue you use to glue a mustache in the cinema, for example.
Yeah.
And the devices fall off the bats within 2 to 3 days. So it's very, very short term
Oh,
and
interesting.
focused. Yeah, and the idea is that, and we always also, we pay attention to the weight. We don't want to overload them, but we have a lot of data showing that for at least for such short periods, there will be no harm to the bats.
Hmm.
Another option is, in my lab, we have a colony of bats that is free. The bats fly out and come back. And then we can use collars, for example, and this allows us to mount the devices for longer periods. So when the bats come back every few days, we can remove the collar and check that everything's okay and put it back. And also, if the bats decide to leave the colony, as they do, we know that within a few months the collar will break and fall off the bats. So those are the main methods to mount. And of course, we try to do everything we can to make sure that we're not harming any bats.
Right, of course. What are you tracking and studying when you put a GPS tracker on a bat? What's the purpose of that?
Yeah, I would say, there are a lot of questions, but I would say there are two maybe major questions. One is navigation. So how they move, how they navigate. I can give in one example. We ran a study in which we mounted GPS devices on young bats and followed them continuously from their first movements outside and until they become adults, until they're 6 months old, more or less. And we see how they map the environment and how they start using what we call cognitive map navigation. So how they start performing shortcuts. Okay, so let's say they've always moved from the colony to point A or to point B, right? We've always seen them doing this, and we have GPS, so we know everything they do. And then at some point, we see them moving directly between point A and point B. So this is what we call a shortcut, and this suggests that they have some kind of mental cognitive representation of the environment, right? It's as if they have a map of the environment in their brain. So that's one example. Another aspect that we work on with these miniature tags is echolocation. So the tags also have microphones, ultrasonic microphones, which allow us to record the bats. And here we've shown, for example, one of the questions we've been focused on is social interference and also social the benefits of social foraging. So when moving together with other bats, what are the benefits and what are the disadvantages? So for example, competition, if there are too many bats, maybe there's not enough food for everyone. But on the other
Hmm.
hand, when bats move as a group, they can benefit from the echolocation of others. So if they hear that another bat detected food, they can immediately, hurry in that direction and find the food. And we've shown both of these phenomena. And the advantage of the microphone here is that in addition to hearing the bat itself, you can also hear other bats. So what we call conspecifics. So we can use the
Yeah.
microphone as a proxy for the density of other individuals, which is something, with GPS is very hard because you need to tag too many bats, right? There are many bats, and if they're moving in different directions, the chances that you record interactions are very, very small. But with the microphone, you get an assessment, you get some kind of a proxy for the density of bats around you.
This this tracking of the bats, when you're looking at their flight paths throughout time, um, how localized are they? Do they migrate like birds to? Will
Hmm.
they migrate to other like long distance locations?
So most bats are what we call central place foragers, which means that every night they will fly out of the roost. They can fly sometimes 100 kilometers, by the way. We have one bat in Mexico we tracked
Wow.
that flew 100 kilometers. This is a nectar feeding bat, so it feeds on cacti. It flew 100 kilometers, fed, and then came back to the cave where it had a pup. So usually this would be,
Wow.
most of them fly less, they fly a few kilometers, but this would be the way they forage and the way they move. Seasonally, some bats migrate, yeah, and then they will fly also. They can fly sometimes 200 kilometers per night, and sometimes the migration route adds up to thousands of kilometers even. But
Hmm.
this is more or less the scale. Yeah.
And are they moving from colder to warmer, I would assume?
Not necessarily. So that's interesting. It's very
Hmm.
different from birds. So they move either they're moving on a food gradient, and then maybe it's the temperature might also change, but it's more about where I can find food. So for example, that bat I mentioned in Mexico, they move along what we call like a flower route. So wherever you have flowers, that's where I want to be right now. So it is related, of course, to temperature. But some bats they move in order to hibernate. So they will switch location and hibernate, and then they will not necessarily move south or warmer to the warmer environments in winter because what's important is where do I have a good what we call a hibernacula, so a cave where the conditions for hibernations are good. Sometimes they will even move north in winter as long as there's a proper cave for
Hmm.
hibernation.
How do they know if there's a proper cave? Are they sending out scouts or?
Yeah, finding a proper roost is another big question. We don't, especially when you're talking about hibernation. I guess it's related to a lot of trial and error by many bats until you find a good place, and then there is definitely a strong social component. So you definitely want to
Hmm.
roost where there are other bats. Even if I don't think of migration, even the food bats that I mentioned earlier, we know that they locate new roosts, new colonies in their area. And we think that the way they do it is based on the density of bats that they encounter. So if you encounter many bats, this suggests that there is a roost nearby, and then eventually you can hear the roost from not from very large distances, but from maybe hundreds of meters or 100 meters or something like that. But we don't really know. These are all hypotheses.
Yeah. When the you mentioned that one bat that flew like 100 kilometers to go get food and then came
Yeah,
back, will that bat alert all of the other bats in the colony? I don't know what's the group of bats called. Is it a
a,
colony?
a colony. Yeah,
Yeah. Will that bat alert all the other bats that there's food over there? And like an ant or something like that?
yeah. So they don't operate as an ant or a bee hive because they're. You have to remember they're not eusocial. So there's no queen that they are all working for. They are all individuals.
Hmm.
We don't know yet. This is also a very interesting question. We don't know yet about voluntary information transfer. So I come and I tell you, look, there is food. We do think that this operates. So we do think that the colony is a place where you can get information about what's available. And we think that it's more about me taking information from you. So you can imagine, for example, I perch next to you and then I smell what you ate. And if you're a fruit bat, for example, I say, oh, we found this great, I don't know, in where I work in Israel, it will be parsimon. It's a very short period fruit, and when it arrives, and it's super sweet, and they love it. And when it arrives, it's you have to get there fast, otherwise there'll be no more. And I think many of them know where. And here's now is a question: how did they gain this knowledge? But a lot of this knowledge is gained by individual exploration. And now I smell you. I realize that it's the time of the year, the right time of the year, and then I will head to a tree that I have already visited in the past. Okay, so it's a kind of gleaning information, wisdom of the crowds, if you want, but then based on a lot of individual knowledge. Um, that's what we currently know. Maybe there are cases where they really teach each other or provide information. As I said, there are many bat species we don't really know. Most of them we just don't really know much about their behavior.
How sensory is their olfactory system? If they're able to smell what the person ate 100 kilometers ago.
Yeah, that's another a good question. Again, don't know much about. There are a few experiments showing how good fruit bats are with their olfactory system. I can tell you anecdotally when I was working with fruit bats in a completely dark room. So I was training them on a sonar task, but I was feeding them with bananas. And if I would drop a tiny piece of banana in the room it was big, it was a 5 meter by 5 meter, they would sniff it and find it. Okay, I was always shocked to see that they would start hovering above it, and then they're also above in the air, and they would land next to it, and they were only using olfaction. And I knew this for sure. I had night vision goggles, and I could see that they can't see it. They're sniffing their way to find it. Right? You could really hear them. So
Hmm.
I always wanted to quantify this. We're running some experiments now that a little bit are related to this, but it's very hard to develop to design a very good experiment to measure this accuracy. But they're very very good. But I can't say
And
if
they're
they can
use
smell something from 10 kilometers. We don't know.
Yeah, right. They're use social, so they don't have a alpha or someone in charge. Does that contribute? Because I think I was listening to a talk you gave, and they sometimes bats will like stay over at a friend's house. They'll go to another colony and spend the evening there, and then come back to their own colony.
Yeah, so there's a lot of okay. Again, this will depend on the species, but a lot of species, I wouldn't say use social. I would just say they're highly social, and it's I call it sometimes it's a bottom up society, if you want. So there's no leadership
Hmm.
and no clear leadership. At least there might be some individuals that are more dominant, but they cannot control 1,000 or 10,000, 100,000 bats. And yeah, a lot of bats exhibit what we call fission fusion. So they will. So you can think of a big population that has hundreds of thousands of bats, and there are, I don't know, hundreds of roosts, and they will not roost in the same place always. So they will move between roosts. In some experiments, some colleagues in Germany, for example, have really quantified it. These are bats that roost in tree holes, and they really measured and build networks of which bats tend to roost with which other bats. In the case of the Egyptian fruit bats that I mentioned earlier, the colonies are very large, thousands of bats, and we do see this movement between colonies, and we don't understand exactly what's the purpose. It could be gaining information, right? What we talked about
Hmm.
earlier. I moved to a colony to see if there's new information. It could also just be that I need to have backup colonies in case my colony is destroyed, and this is something that happens. I need to have backup colonies. I need to constantly update my knowledge about other colonies. So
Hmm.
yeah, this is another. As you see, there are a lot of open questions.
But they're not aggressive towards other colonies in the way that some animals are.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if any um, clear case of like clear intercolony aggression or war or warfare or anything like that. Yeah, we do know sometimes about there are acoustic dialects, so colonies can have vocalizations that are slightly different within the
Hmm.
same species. Yeah, that's very interesting. So this could suggest that maybe I can identify if you're from my colony or not. Maybe this will affect my behavior, but I haven't encountered any work on real aggression towards outsiders, like from other colonies.
So bats have or can have like accents
Yeah,
within different colonies.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah, yeah. We even have shown
Fascinating.
that in a laboratory experiment where we had bats and we played back. We created an accent, so we didn't take a different colony. We created an accent, so we took the vocal repertoire and we manipulated it, and we showed that after a year with exposure to this dialect or accent, the bats changed their own accent in the direction of the playback.
But that's not causing any social ostracization.
It's a
That's
good
just a
question.
thing that
Yeah,
happens.
we don't know. We don't know. That's a good question. Yeah,
Yeah.
we don't know about, as I said, aggression, but maybe you do select where you wanna whom you wanna mate with or something. We don't know.
Right. Yeah. The they have the ability to produce different different accented sounds. Do they have like a vocal language that has different words or I don't know how to ask this
Yeah,
question
yeah,
correctly, but
yeah. We don't know in general whether animals have words, except for there are a few examples, alarm calls um,
mhm.
and stuff like that. We have shown that there is information, so I can take a call and say if it was emitted by the bat during, for example, a fight over food or an attempt to mate. So there is information about the context where the when this vocalization was uttered. But these are not words to any degree, right? Words are discrete syllables. In this case, it's much more continuous. The differences are more in the details, and it's not as if I can say, okay, this is A, this is B. A always looks like A, B always looks like B. But this is what you just asked is a big question about animal communication in general. What is the structure of information? And we see a gradient from very discrete signals, like in songbirds, we have what we call syllables, and they're very different from each other, to very continuous signals, like in some bats, for example.
I would love if AI could help us
Yeah.
understand animals' language. I think that'd be amazing.
Yeah, so the study that I mentioned earlier was all about AI. We actually took a lot of vocalizations. We annotated them manually based on vision. So we had to look at the bats. Takes a lot of time. AI, a lot of it. Today you have very clever unsupervised machines, but in general, a lot of AI is based on supervision, on showing it examples that are already annotated, and that's a big bottleneck for anyone studying animal communication. But the study that I mentioned, where we saw that there is information, was done using AI. We used a statistical classifier, basically a machine that is trained and then later on is fed with new data and identifies. In this case, we called it context. So whether the vocalization was in the context of fighting about food or fighting about mating or something else. And
Hmm.
definitely AI is the I don't want to say solution. Solution may be too strong, but it's the future. We have to be careful. We know that AI can learn very like ridiculous connections or patterns, because that's what it does. It just learns whatever's out there. So you have to be very careful. But I'm very optimistic about the use of AI.
I don't know if it would ever be possible, but it would be wonderful to be able to communicate to these animals.
Yeah, it's something a lot of journalists are asking me about these days. I think, yeah, we will be able to maybe understand more, maybe also to communicate more. I don't think we will communicate like you and I are communicating, because I think that human language is uh, fundamentally different from all other animal communication systems, like they're saying, even though, of course, we don't know much. But still, I think it's very, very different because of the vocabulary, the syntax, the ability to connect words, as we said, and to convey very complex messages, which I think doesn't exist in any other animal communication system. Although you can see precursors, it's not as if I think humans are have arrived from Mars with this ability. It's all based on, yeah, you can see the precursors in the animal kingdom, of course, but still there's a gap. There is a gap there, which is also very interesting. Where did this gap came from? It's a huge question, I think.
Well, I would answer the question as a Christian that it's because humans are made in the image of God, but that
That's
that may not be your interpretation. So,
yeah.
um, I'd be curious as far as mating goes. Is there how does that work as far as the female's mate selection? What indicates to her that this is a stronger bat and one worth mating with?
Yeah, I can answer again because there are so many bats, and in most cases we don't understand. So I can answer about one specific bat that we've tested, the Egyptian fruit bat again. And there we've actually shown that there is a kind of a selection process that the females go through, and it's based
Hmm.
on providing. It's not as if, okay, so I'll explain what we saw, and then maybe I'll give the interpretation. What we saw is that towards the mating period, the females will scrounge food from males. So this was done in captivity. So we put a lot of food in the colony, and then a male would take a piece of fruit, and then a female would take this fruit from the male. And over time, we see that they kind of, I call it, they build relationships. So the same female consistently takes food from the same male. And if you look at the strengths of these relationships, you see that towards the mating, they're building. Now, it's not as if the female needs this food, right? Because she can go to the bowl by herself, right? I interpret it again with my human eyes as something that is more related to building some kind of bond. And eventually,
Hmm.
we find that the chances that the female will mate with one of these males with which so that the stronger the bond or the relationship, the higher the chances that she will mate with one of these males. So it seems to us as a kind of a bond building test. It's not really clear, with mating, we always ask ourselves, why is she selecting the male? The male is not going to be involved in with the offspring at all. Okay, only the females
Hmm.
lactate, and we also showed in another study that they will guide the young pups outside. They show them how to navigate or which trees they navigate to. So it's all about the female. The male is not involved. So it's not about that. So maybe she's selecting better genes that can provide food. We don't know for sure.
So they're not monogamous. They'll will she mate with multiple males or is it
So,
just one
so
male?
yeah, good question. It's seasonal. In this species, it's what we call seasonal monogamy. So every season
Okay.
she will mate with one male. Yeah. In some
Got
cases,
it.
some bats have what we call a harem, where one male will actually mate with multiple females over many years. So they,
Hmm.
they they keep the same harem for years, and other males fight. It's a little bit like many other animals that we're familiar with. The other males will fight for taking over. Some of the offspring might wait and take over the harem. Um, yeah, I don't. In many species, we just don't know. You have to observe them carefully, and we don't know exactly what's the mating system.
How many children do they have? How many babies do they have at once?
One or two. So it's
Okay.
very, yeah, it's, they need to fly with their pups. So it's not something, you cannot fly with six pups, I guess. Most
Yeah.
species it will be one, and also once per year. So very slow reproduction rate. Some cases
Interesting.
they will have two, like twins. In some cases they will also have twice per year. But at most it will be four pups per year. So very, very slow reproduction rate. And this is also probably one of the reasons why they live very long. So bats can live
Hmm.
20, 30, 40 years. So we often see a
Wow.
correlation between the rate of reproduction and the number of offspring, or the of the and sorry and your longevity, and how long
Lifespan.
do you,
Yeah,
yeah, your
yeah.
lifespan exactly.
Interesting. So is that how variable is that on species? Are there some species that are significantly longer living?
Yes, that's what we think. Yes, but and it seems like hibernating species, for example, live longer. But
Hmm.
again, we have a big gap of knowledge because for many species, we don't know for sure. Like if we're following a colony, how do we measure age? If we're following a colony outdoors, we can mark the bats, right? For example, people put small rings like they do with birds. So they will mark the bats, and then we can come back year after year, sometimes, for 20, 30 years. Some of these studies are very long term. But if a bat disappears, how do you know if it's dead, right? I mean, you assume it's dead, right? But maybe it just left, right? Maybe it was preyed on. So that's death, of course, but it's not longevity. It's not related to longevity.
Yeah.
It's predation. So we don't know. So yeah, probably there is variability. Probably hibernating species live longer, but I would say again, we don't necessarily know.
Do we know why hibernating species? Is there a hypothesis as to why they might live longer?
Yeah, the hypothesis is, I'm not a physiologist, but the hypothesis is basically their physiology stops. Everything stops, right, during hibernation. Everything, their
Interesting.
body
Okay.
temperature drops to 4 degrees Celsius. That's almost, right, that's zero
That's
basically.
yeah.
It's freezing. I know you probably think in Fahrenheit. Um, I need to calculate that in Fahrenheit, but it's around
Yes.
32, right? That's the freezing in Fahrenheit,
Yeah,
and it's a
32.
bit
So that's
higher.
probably like 40 or something
Yeah,
degrees.
exactly. A
Not
little
very
bit
warm.
higher. Exactly. And everything stops. By the way, even some females can be pregnant, and the pregnancy even stops. And
Whoa.
yeah, exactly. So is it just a simple ratio that they pause for a few months and then live longer? I don't think so. Maybe it's even more than that. We also know that bats have special like DNA fixing mechanisms, very strong immune system. So there may be maybe probably
Mm.
um, many other mechanisms that allow longevity, and maybe they're related to hibernation. Maybe you need a strong immune system because you're hibernating, even though some people would say it's more related to flight. We don't know. There are a lot of questions that are open, I think.
Talk to me a little more about their immune system. I've heard it's very strong.
Again, this is not my expertise at all. It's becoming a very hot topic. People are super interested because it seems that many bats can cope with viruses and survive. So we see that their immune system suggests that they were carriers of the virus, but we don't see the virus anymore. So it's not as
Mm.
if they're carrying a lot of viruses, as some people think. It's more that they can probably handle more viruses than other mammalian immune systems. If you look at the number of pathogenic viruses that they will potentially pass to humans, as much as I know, bats are not unique. They're not more dangerous than any other mammals. Of course, the most viruses we can get are from humans, right? Or from the closer relatives to
Right.
us, apes, for example. And
Yeah.
yeah, one thing I can say about the immune system, this is very much hand waving, so I hope there's no immunologist listening to this. But it seems like their system is always more alert than other systems, so it's more potent. So a lot of these molecules that in our system will be secreted only after the body detects some kind of some kind of a threat. In bats, they always keep their system slightly alert, and
Mm.
maybe this helps them respond more quickly. Maybe this is related to the fact that they fly, and thus their body temperature is always elevated, so they're always in a kind of a situation of stress. Maybe so
Mm.
when a bat flies, its body temperature goes up by several degrees. Okay, so that's like
Mm.
for us, this would be a situation of sickness, right? When our
Right.
body temperature goes up by 7 degrees, we're sick. Yeah, but again, a lot of mysteries and a lot of interesting research that is going on these days. I'm more interested, or I study bat behavior and sensory systems, but in parallel, there are a lot of people now interested in bat immune systems.
Yeah. It would be interesting to know if, because of the significant rise in temperature when they're flying, if that kind of burns off any malicious viruses in their system in a similar way to how you'll burn up in a fever and then the fever will break.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, you
Yeah,
may not
I
know, but
also
that'd
I'm
be
always
interesting.
careful, I'm not an immunologist. So, I think some people say the opposite, that they're in stress because of this body temperature, but I don't know.
Huh.
I don't dare, I don't want to give an answer.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit more about their social lives. You've mentioned that they don't have a clear alpha, but it seems that um, they are pretty generous, pretty open-minded as far as like as far as a community goes. They're very tight knit. They're pretty open as far as that goes.
Yeah, so maybe I'll give an example again, because it's very hard to talk about bats, right? There are many bats and many species. So one of the most interesting stories is the vampire, actually the story of vampire bats. Okay, it's
Hmm.
a bit surprising, but there are species which we call vampires, three species in Central America. We call them vampires because they feed on blood. It's a very small amount of blood. It's nothing that kills you. Mosquitoes are also vampires, right? But yeah, they do feed on blood. Usually, some of them mammalian blood, and usually not humans. But if there are humans around and it's easy to approach, they might also feed on human blood. It's nothing, it's nothing you shouldn't. It's not as if they come to your jugular vein or something like that. It's more like you will wake up and you will see like a mosquito bite on your hand, and this suggests
Hmm.
that there's been a vampire. And vampire bats sometimes return to their colonies without finding food, which is a disaster, of course, because if you haven't eaten, especially if you're a vampire bat and if you haven't eaten for a few days, this might mean death for you.
Hmm.
And what has been shown by a few colleagues of mine, Jerry Wilkinson, Jerry Carter, both of which, by the way, are interviewed in the book, is that they are altruistic. So if you come home and you haven't
Hmm.
found food, another member of the colony will approach you, and it will usually be the member of the colony who initiates this, and it will regurgitate blood, digested blood, and feed you basically. And this is not necessarily a family member, so somebody who is not related to you,
Hmm.
more than any other bat in the colony. And it's more in what we call, or what they call, reciprocal altruism. That's the idea. So the idea is that, I help you today and we build this bond, and maybe in 6 months I will need help and you will help me. And somehow they know to build these bonds over time, and they also know, you could ask me, okay, what if I cheat? What if you give me and I never give back? They will know this. They will detect, and over time, if you're a cheater, you will stop getting help from other bats. So they really have this network that takes time to build, and it's a multi-year network. So I can maybe I will only get back something from you in a few years, and it's still worth it. So that's, I think, one of the most interesting social stories in bats, and maybe also in general in mammals.
That's fascinating. Is the affinity between bats closer between bats of the same family, or is it kind of if you're in our colony, that's enough? You're in.
Most cases, there's no family issue, except I mentioned these harems, right, where you have a
Hmm.
male guarding. Sorry. Oh, uh, there was just a message about a call. Oh, 1 second. I'll just my WhatsApp is. I'll just turn off my WhatsApp. I apologize.
You're fine.
You still hear me, okay, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
I guess
yeah.
you didn't hear it. I got suddenly it was ringing.
Ah, no, I
Um,
didn't hear it.
Okay. Yeah, so we were talking about, yeah, so I'll start again. I will say some of these bats that live in harems, then there will be one male that guards females, and the females, their offspring, will sometimes be part of sometimes the offspring will be part of the colony, and they will be waiting there for their opportunity. And sometimes they will also initiate or create their own harem on the same tree. These are bats that often roost on the bark of a tree. and sometimes they will create their own harem that is a neighboring harem. So those are cases where we do see some kind of big families or clans, if you want. But
Hmm.
that's the only real case that I know. Of course, there are some offspring that stay with their mothers for very long. So there's some bats where you will see small families of a couple and offspring for several months or a year together. But I don't know much more than that.
Yeah. Is there ever social ostracization? Oh, I can't say that word. Where they'll kick someone out of the clan or out of the colony.
Okay, one example that I can give is related to sickness. We've studied this. They don't kick. We actually, okay, so the phenomena that we've observed is that sick bats will often exit the not the colony, but the cluster. Within a cave, within a roost, you will have a cluster with, let's say, I don't know, 30, 100 bats, and bats that are obviously sick, we can also measure that they will be perching outside the cluster. And one of the questions we were wondering is whether they are kicked out or do they leave voluntarily. And what we find is the latter, actually. So a sick
Hmm.
bat will make its way out of the cluster and perch alone. This is, if you think of it, it's very similar to what we call sickness behavior also in humans or in other animals, right? If when
Yeah.
you're sick, the last thing that you want is to be in a crowd of other humans, right? You just want to be
Right.
alone in bed, preferably, and have
Quarantined.
as exactly
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
little contact as possible. And we don't know if it's the same, that you just don't want to invest in social interactions. We're not sure exactly what's the reason, what's the cause, and what's the result. But one result is that the chances of other bats being infected decreases, right? By the way,
Hmm.
also, if we go back to human bat interactions, if, as I said, sick bats, they tend to isolate themselves. They will not go out to forage also. They stay inside the cave. And thus, if humans don't go into caves, if humans don't interrupt, if humans don't disturb the animals, the chances that we get sick from a bat, that we're infected by a bat, are very, very low. All of these cases where we might have been infected by bats, we're not sure in most cases, um, then these are cases where humans really entered caves, caught bats. Some places, people eat bats. Those are the causes probably, and bats actually prefer to be isolated when they're sick.
Hmm. Fascinating. And I would assume that they're welcomed back in as soon as they're well again.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. What is as far as the echolocation goes, do they have their own unique signal, a unique chirp that they use to distinguish, you know, um, what they're echolocating as opposed to what this guy right here is echolocating?
yeah. Great question. Overall, the chips are very similar. And the reason is that they have a sensory function. So they're adapted to the function. Okay. But we and others have shown that still, even though they're very similar, there are tiny differences, spectral differences, which are probably a function of the vocal, what we call the vocal tract. So you and I, we both can say, I don't know, A, it will sound very similar, but there might be small differences. In their case, it's even more similar. And the differences are because, I have, I don't know, a larger vocal tract than you, or vice versa. And that will change the resonances and that will alter the frequencies. And this probably allows them to some extent to know if a signal, when many bats are flying together, we mentioned this problem already, then it will allow them, for example, to tell apart if the echo is my echo or your echo, for example. And that's super important when we're flying in a big group because that can be very, very difficult to solve.
Hmm. Fascinating. And is there this may be a stupid question, but does their skin or their membrane have anything to do with um, their ability to distinguish between their chirps and someone else's chirps?
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything that like this, but people have shown that their skin, their membrane, which is a kind of skin, has hair cells which are sensitive to airflow. Sorry. So
Hmm.
so they're very important, probably for When you're flying, you want to know where your wings are, how fast they're moving, how
Right.
fast you're moving, stuff like that. I don't think anyone connected this to echolocation. It will probably also be very difficult because sound doesn't really, the vibrations that we create are minute in terms of pressure. So I don't think that the wings can sense that. You know, who knows? There are things that we didn't think that are possible, and we discovered that are true.
And here we are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, when they're echolocating something that they're hunting, does that animal or does that bug know that it's being hunted? Like, can it
Mm.
feel the sonar hitting it?
Some insects have evolved hearing organs. Some moths, for example, uh,
Hmm.
they're very simple ears. They're sometimes on their abdomen. They're not in the head at all. It looks like a very small membrane, and it can detect the bat calls. Okay, people have studied this. Yeah, and some insects are completely unaware, and they will just be eaten, without even knowing. Some will evade. And for example, with moths, we know they have several evading strategies. Some of them will drop, so it's kind of trying to these movies where there's something on the sonar and you see it, suddenly disappears. So that's what they're trying to do probably. Some of them start moving very what we call erratically, so start turning or something like that, because then it's much more difficult for a bat to intercept. So yeah, it depends on the insect.
Hmm. Interesting. And how are the bats counteracting something like the moth
Hmm.
who can drop?
Yeah, it's we call this an arms race, right? So both sides are trying to improve, or evolution is changing them constantly. Bats, there are several strategies that have been detected. Some bats use very high frequencies, maybe so that insects don't hear them. We don't know for sure. Some bats have been suggested to lower their amplitude of emission, so they don't shout as loud as they can, because the ear of the insect is not as sensitive as the one of the bat. So this is why we call this stealth hunting. So they kind of creep on the insect. In some cases, they miss. We know that the bats don't always catch the insects.
But they're not um, silent when they're flying. I mean, videos of bats, they're pretty
Not
loud when
not
they're.
fully silent, although there's been a debate there too. There have been a few suggestions of bats that might be nearly silent, maybe for short intervals, very short intervals. But yeah, I would say they're mostly echolocating, not silent.
Hmm. How dangerous are they? I mean, other than the vampire bat, and the vampire bat carries some diseases with it so that you should be
Could, but
concerned
any
about.
mammal, any dog can carry disease, right? It's not something unique to
Yeah.
bats.
How much of a threat are they to us and us maybe us to them, vice versa?
Yeah, I would say they're more helpful, if you want, than any threat. So, for example, bats eat insects in tons, and that's super important for farmers. We know that when there are no bats, then farmers have to use more pesticides, which is of course very
Hmm.
unhealthy for us. And there are many other ways there where bats assist humans, if you want. They pollinate different plants. They do what we call seed dispersal. They will fly they will eat a fruit and then fly far, and this is how they allow trees to move around. Um, yeah, I don't think they're much of a threat. Of course, some diseases can be transferred from bats to us and vice versa. We know that COVID, the famous COVID, actually could not. So the COVID that was found in bats could not infect humans. Okay, they found a virus in bats that is related to COVID, and that one cannot infect humans. So I cannot get COVID from that bat. And on the
Hmm.
other hand, the COVID that we had, some bats could be, at least some bats could be infected by it. So we could transfer COVID to bats and not vice versa. Okay. So,
Huh.
so yeah. So it doesn't mean, we don't know everything. There might be other viruses that are the other way around. It just shows you
Yeah.
how much disinformation there is on the media. And you really have to be careful. And some people they're very quick in saying things. Some people, even scientists, they sometimes say things too quickly, and we just have to be very cautious and critical when we read things.
100%. I think the bar for evidence for us generally needs to be a little higher than it is, but I don't
Yeah,
think social media is super
especially
helping with that.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, are they uh, are they being reintroduced as another form of pesticide? Call it. Um, are people trying that?
Yeah, some people put bat boxes and they try to attract. We can't reintroduce them, really. I'm not aware of anyone doing that. People are trying sometimes to use bat boxes to lure bats to roost nearby. There's also debate about that. If we want to change the community of bats where we are. I don't think that there's any major success in this, but there are a few examples of people who've managed to bring hundreds of bats into their bat boxes, and maybe that had some impact on, I don't know, for example, mosquito density.
Yeah. No, it'd be wonderful to be able to use bats instead of pesticides or anything like that to
Right. It's
keep
it's already
fields safe. But
happening,
I,
so we mostly should just not interfere. That's most of what we should
yeah,
do. Yeah.
yes, yes. Is it are this again maybe a stupid question, but are windmills being a problem for bats? I know that they've drastically reduced the population of hawks.
Yeah.
Um, is something
Wind
similar
wind
happening?
turbines, so wind energy is a big problem. So we know that it's killing a lot of bats. Some people estimate millions per year. We know that there are, I would say, so okay, there is one very good solution, and that is not to operate the turbine at low wind speed. So at low wind speed,
Hmm.
usually below 6 meters per second, there's very little energy produced, and that's where most bats are active. So if you just turn off the turbines, and not all farms agree to do that, then you will already be saving most bats. There are other solutions like to run surveys to be sure, before and after you establish the turbines. But definitely today, this is one of the main threats for bats.
And deforestation is also up there as
Of
a big
course.
threat.
Habitat, any
Yeah,
any any change of habitat, it doesn't have to be forest, right? It can be any type of change
right.
of habitat because you have desert bats as well. Any type of, and that's exactly one of, I would say, the main thing that we're doing, which is interfering with bats.
What got you into bats and prompted you to write a book about them?
The book is a result of 20 years of work, and so many stories moving around the world, meeting people. And again, I said there's so many people who are mentioned in the book who who've had spent their whole careers, and these are sometimes 50 years of a career studying bats in very very remote places. I myself, I was always interested in animals. I was always fascinated by animals as a child. I always, I looked at animals and also tried to raise some animals as much as my parents allowed me. And then when I went to college, I studied physics in addition to biology. I want to study biology, but also physics. And then I encountered bats' use of sonar echolocation, which is basically a pure example of how nature is applying physics for sensing in this case.
Hmm.
And I was really fascinated. And then I actually did my PhD in Germany in a lab that was at the time one of the leading labs for studying echolocation. And yeah, and from there on, I just, I became more and more interested. I realized how diverse they are. I started with echolocation, but I realized that they have a fascinating social life, which we've discussed a lot today. And as I said, anywhere you look, there's an interesting bat species with an interesting behavior. Anything that you're interested in, there will be a bat that can probably do and would be very interesting to study.
Yeah. What was your PhD on? Was it on the just broad echolocation or something
It was
specific?
about, it was very technical. We used AI actually to look at echoes, artificial echoes that I generated. I had a machine that could emit sound, and we tried to build a classifier. So I just like you could use today radar with autonomous cars in order to say if there's a car in front of you or not. We were trying to identify objects based on how they sound, what they sound like. So yeah,
Hmm.
very, very applicative, but it was based on a question of whether bats can do this actually. So something we discussed earlier today.
Yeah. Yeah. Where can people find you online? And I think you've given some talks and then find the book.
Yeah, if you Google my name, Yossi Yovel, you can find a lot of talks. You can find our lab website. And the book is called The Genius Bat. You can find it today anywhere. All of the online stores offer it, sell it.
Fantastic. I'll put links in the description for as many things as I can find. And, you know, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.
See you guys.